Hey, friends, how's it going? Welcome to our Bible study. We are so excited to be here with you. It's the sort of Christmas themed Bible study for us for December. I'm Austen. I'm the executive director here at Transmission Ministry Collective, and I am joined by.
I'm Micah and I'm the program coordinator.
And I'm Peter. I'm the development coordinator.
Yeah, and we're all super excited to be here to talk about this passage tonight and be here with y'all and say hey in the chat. So I see a couple of people in the chat already. I see Jenny, I see Eden. Hello. If y'all are watching along, feel free to say hi in the chat. We're always happy to see you, and we love getting to talk with you about these passages and throw questions out there and see if y'all have thoughts about them. So that's what we're going to do tonight. Let me think. Are there any other things that I should do? We introduced ourselves. We've got some announcements. Let me tell you the announcements before we get going too far. All right, announcements. The first major announcement is our TMC Christmas Hangout is happening tomorrow at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern for 2 hours. And so that's our Christmas Hangout. That's for all the trans and gender expansive folks in our community. So if you are one of those folks, if you're already signed up for any support group, you'll automatically get an email. And if you have not signed up for a support group, but you want to join the Hangout, I'm going to put the link in the chat right now. There we go. Hopefully that worked. So you should be able to use that link if you want to sign up for the Hangouts. Let's see, other things. Our transgeneration group is moved to after the Hangout on Friday, so that's exciting. So if you're a part of the transgen group, look for an email on that. And then a reminder that we don't have support groups next week, but we will be back on January 3rd with our normal fundraisers, our normal support groups. I was looking at too many text things at once. Our normal support groups will be up back again on the first week of January. And we're going to be excited to talk to you all about how the holidays went and be there for you if you have thoughts or experiences that you want to process. And then last announcement is that our end of the year fundraiser is up. And so if you want to be part of that fundraiser and support stuff like this, our workshops, our Bible studies, our support groups, all the cool things we do, our hangouts, you can support us through that fundraiser. And we've got that link in the chat as well. Awesome. Hi, Isaac. Good to see you. Glad you're not snowy. So here we are. Tonight, we are going to be talking about a story it's more of a poem than it is a story, really, when you come down to it. We're going to be talking about the first chapter of the Gospel of John, not the whole thing, just part of it. But it's a passage that's associated with the Christmas season and associated with the idea of the incarnation, God becoming human. And so we're going to talk about it as part of our sort of Christmas Bible study tonight. And we're going to talk about themes of light and darkness. If you are in the Northern Hemisphere, like a lot of us are, tonight is the longest, darkest night of the year. And if you are in the Southern Hemisphere, like Isaac is, you are having the shortest night of the year, and it is bright and sunny there. So it's an interesting passage to read during this time of year. We're going to do a couple of things. First, we're going to read it the whole way through, and then we're going to read it bit by bit and talk about it kind of verse by verse. Yay, Sophia, and yay, Jolene. I'm glad you're here. So, Peter, I believe you're going to read the whole passage through first, right?
Yeah, I've got the First Nations version that I'm going to read from tonight.
Nice.
So this is John 1 through 18. Long ago, in the time before all days, before the creation of all things, the one who is known as the Word was there face to face with the Great Spirit. This Word fully represents Creator and shows us who he is and what he is like. He has always been there from the beginning, for the Word and Creator are one and the same. Through the Word, all things came into being, and not one thing exists that he did not create. Creator's life shined out from the Word, giving light to all human beings. This is the true light that comes to all the peoples of the world and shines on everyone. The light shines into the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it or put it out. Into the wilderness of the land of promise came a man named Gift of Goodwill. He was sent by the Great Spirit to tell what he knew about the light so everyone could believe. He was not the light, but came to speak the truth about the light. The true light that shines on all people was coming into the darkness of this world. He came down into this world, and even though he made all things, the world did not recognize him. Even his own tribe did not welcome or honor him. But all who welcome and trust him receive their birthright as children of the Great Spirit. They are born in a new way, not from a human father's plans or desires, but born from above by the Great Spirit. Creator's word became a flesh and blood human being and pitched his sacred tent among us, living as one of us. We looked upon his great beauty and saw how honorable he was, the kind of honor held only by this one Son who fully represents his Father, full of his great kindness and truth. Gift of Goodwill told what he knew about him and cried out with a loud voice, "The one I have told you about is here. He comes after me, but is much greater, my elder. He has more honor, for even though he is thought to be younger, he existed before I was born." From the fullness of his being, we have all had many gifts of kindness poured out on us. Drawn from the water gave us our tribal laws, but the gift of great kindness and truth came from Creator sets free, the chosen one. No one has ever seen the Great Spirit, but the one Son, who is himself the Great Spirit and closest to the Father's heart, has shown us what he is like.
That's
Wow,
such a
that
great
is,
translation.
I was going to say that's such a beautiful translation. It takes, I mean, also too, I love in general this passage because it is incredibly poetic. And that just takes the poetry and like I feel like it just abounds and like it's so beautiful. Wow, thank you.
Yeah, so for folks that joined us maybe late and didn't hear, that was from the First Nations version, which is a translation done by a whole bunch of different North American Indigenous scholars. And it's really, really cool. So we wanted to read that one all through it, the way through. We're going to be talking about this passage and kind of going through it verse by verse. So if you need to have that up and in front of you, go ahead and grab that. And we're just doing the first 18 verses, which is not as long as it sounds. If you want a quick way to see those, I'm going to put those in the chat the correct way. There we go. So now you should be able to check that link and read along with us if you want to. Before we even get too much into it, we should talk a little bit about the background of this passage. So this is the first chapter of John, right? The first chapter of the Gospel of John. So for anybody in the chat who wants to share, or for Micah or for Peter, as we're thinking about like what makes John's gospel different from the other gospels, like why does it start out this way? What makes it different? What do y'all think?
One immediate difference I note is, first of all, this starts with creation. None of the other, like, it's this talking about like this parallels between in the beginning was the Word and the Word was with God. And so like I think I see just a lot of this parallel of the act of creation that's happening here. And the other gospels, it's fascinating to me that the author of John frames that way, because the other passages or the other gospels don't start that way. Like Mark starts out with a voice crying out in the wilderness, and Matthew starts out with, I forget the
Just the
is
huge
that
genealogy list.
that's right. I was like,
Mhm.
I know there's a specific thing that Matthew does. So it's really interesting, the framing, because how you start a story or how you start a narrative sets the tone for the rest of the narrative. And so it's just a very fascinating choice to start with this very poetic and also this very poetic language that's reminiscent of creation. And I just find that fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the the having the sort of Mark sort of shows up in media res and is like, Jesus is an adult, here we go. And Matthew is like, here's Jesus's human parentage. So you get like that real emphasis on like family trees. And then Luke is the one that's like, we're going to start out with tiny baby Jesus, like before baby Jesus even. We're going to start off with like before baby John. And then John is like, let's start with some poetry.
I see Eden says, I love the poetry of this gospel and how it mirrors Genesis, which is, I think that's a wonderful observation, and just the way that it parallels. And Genesis, like the opening of Genesis too, that's poetry as well. And so just kind of this idea of beginnings and this parallels that are happening. This John in general is a very poetic gospel. There is a lot of poetic language, which is quite beautiful.
Yeah, definitely. Well, let's dive in. Let's dive into the first part of the text here. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We've talked about how the in the beginning bit is a reference to Genesis 1. But what do we mean when we say the Word? Who are we talking about when we say the Word? Do y'all think, like for folks in chat, when you think of the Word, what comes up for you when you think of it? When it says the Word was with God, what does that mean? I see Jolene saying it's the genealogy of the God side of Jesus, which I love. I love that that's a cool way of thinking about it. But this, like, if Matthew gave us sort of the human side of Jesus, we get the genealogy of the God side of Jesus in John. That's great. Micah,
I've never thought of it that way. That's incredibly beautiful.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Micah, when you think about like the Word, what does the Word mean, do you think?
I think so. The first time I think I ever read this, I'm just like thinking of back when I was, little. The first time I was looking at this and I could not understand it, because in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so just was very confusing to me. I just remember because it's written, this is poetry, and so it's written in a very poetic way. But at the time I didn't fully understand that. And two, like the context of word is really interesting. So in the Greek, this is logos. So logos is the Greek word here. And logos actually literally can be translated to word, it can be translated to reason or plan. And at least in the Greek world, in sort of the Greco-Roman world, the idea of logos came from a sort of deeper meaning of the divine order that kind of orders the cosmos and gives life to the cosmos. And so there is a way that, like, the idea of reason and word and order is actually like in the Greek world was a motivating kind of way that life happens. And I found this like quote from the Britannica Encyclopedia that I thought was really interesting. The idea of the logos in Greek thought harks back to at least the 6th century BCE philosopher Heraclitus, who discerned in the cosmic process a logos or plan or reason or process analogous to the reasoning power in humans. Later, the Stoics, philosophers who followed the teachings of the thinker Zeno in Keratin, defined the logos as an active, rational, and spiritual principle that permeated all reality. So it's really interesting that in the Greek, there is this appeal to this idea, which because of Hellenism and the kind of advance of the Roman Empire, a lot of people would be familiar with this idea, but it's not the only way that logos can be understood, which I think is, so it's just interesting to see the multiple different meanings.
Totally, yeah. So this idea of the logos as reason, or as this sort of like, it's almost like a divine mathematical formula almost. Is like a really cool way of thinking about the logos. I see Casey says the word as the unnameable force of God that can't quite be described. It's just the word. Yeah, there's something about I like how you said unnameable force. That there's like force not in the sense of well, not quite in like the overpowering sense, but in the sort of just like big and powerful sense, right? That like we don't really have a name for.
Almost like
Ooh,
sorry, I meant to
no, go
jump in
ahead.
there. It just reminds me of like we think of gravity as a force,
Mhm.
or like as its force is not necessarily like forceful, but it is
Right.
it's an agency that acts on the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, or like the idea of like kinetic energy that's sort of like stored. Yeah. Tom says, in my first language, French, the word is actually the verb, but I guess to me it's another description of Jesus being begotten of the Father, proceeding forth from. That's really cool. The idea of the word as like the verb, the thing that is. It's not necessarily a noun. It's an action that is happening. And yes, Caitlin is getting to another one of the possible meanings for logos or word here. So Caitlin says, I love that it also harkens back to Proverbs where wisdom is personified as a lady. So yeah, the one of the other ways that we can think about this word is there's sort of the word or reason that is sort of in Greek thought, but then within sort of within ancient Jewish thought, it would be the word spoken from God. So like the Torah, right? So that's another way of thinking about what the word is. And then within the sort of combination of Jewish and Greek culture that became sort of like the Hellenized Jewish world, they kind of like a lot of different ideas about this came together and they started associating the sort of two things of like reason and scripture and the word of God and the idea of wisdom as this sort of personified being shows up. And so Sophia is the word for wisdom. And this idea of wisdom being connected to what's going on in John 1 is actually a really, really old thing. So I've got a quote for us here. This is from Rita Haltman Finger, who wrote a really cool article that we're going to put in the chat here. There we go. On the connection between Sophia and John 1. So she says, Logos was wisdom. Hebrew sages of old were part of a movement that emphasized gaining wisdom through close observation of the natural world. See, for example, Proverbs 6 through 11, about observing the behavior of ants in order to live well. But these sages were not inventing wisdom, they were discovering it. For wisdom was personified as a woman co-creating with God from the beginning. To a Greek-speaking Jewish reader, logos would have been interchangeable with Sophia. Thus, it's appropriate and meaningful for both women and men today to insert Sophia into the prologue of the gospel. So there's this idea here that like the word that is with God is by some, and like in Greek, it is a word that is gendered male. But if we're associating it with the idea of Sophia, that's a Greek word that is gendered female. And so there's stuff going on here with gender and like what this thing was that was with God and then became Jesus. So we're going to talk more about gender as we get into it. But yeah, the idea of logos or the word as wisdom, as reason, as scripture, there's so many options for what this means. Caitlin says, you're saying the word is gender fluid. How about that? I love it. Exactly. Peter, what are your thoughts on this idea of the word and what the word could mean?
Yeah, it's always been one of my favorite kind of like names of God, or like ways of thinking about, like Jesus and Jesus divinity. Like I love the gender fluidity of it, and sort of like word as this like principle of reason, but then also yeah, word as like this figure of wisdom, Sophia. I think that's really beautiful. But I studied literature and philosophy for
Hmm.
my undergrad, so I feel like I got a lot of different like exposure to this idea of logos, and it had a bunch of different resonances. But I like literally thinking about Jesus as the word, and the fact that a word is something that we use to bring meaning,
Mm,
so that
Mhm.
like Jesus is like the meaning maker, or almost like the translation of God to human beings.
Mm,
and a word in that sense, like the way that we can, like words are what we use to like help other people understand what we mean. So Jesus is like the word spoken by God to help us understand God better.
mm.
And I
I
think
love
that,
that.
Translation of God to human beings is a
Mhm.
beautiful way to say that. Like that's,
Mhm.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that like ugh, I have so many thoughts. I'm getting tongue tied. I've got to press pause on that thought and go to what Eden said here in the chat. Eden said, I love also the idea of meaning, reason, or as the spoken word, one is more rational, the other more experiential. Yeah. So like there's a lot going on there in terms of, and honestly, like that's the tied into the Greek idea of like one thing being gendered one way and one thing being gendered another way, that they would see emotional things as more feminine and rational things as more masculine. And so like that's part of how things are gendered. I read a really interesting article in, I have over on my bookshelf there, the Jewish Annotated New Testament, which is, they had a bunch of Jewish scholars that went through the New Testament to kind of talk about like how Jews see Christian scripture. And I was reading a really interesting article in there that talked about why the writer of John wouldn't have used the word Sophia, for instance, rather than logos. And this author was putting forward the argument that the whole reason that John uses the word logos, the word, is because with trying to parallel Genesis 1, in Genesis 1, God speaks the world into being. And so John wanted to keep that moment of speaking by using the word logos and using word rather than something else, which I kind of love the idea of.
yeah, I love that. Yeah, that Jesus is like the word spoken by God
Mhm.
is how it has always struck me.
Yeah. Ugh. Um, oh, yes. And what Caitlin's saying here about the word or logos of Jesus as the conduit of creation. Conduit is a great word. Well, let's jump into the next section here. So we've got this first section, verses 1 through 4, that is kind of this poetic repetition. And actually, another thing I was reading about this passage is the reason that it's got repeated words all the way through is because in the Greek, it's actually set up to be a little bit like a hymn, where the first part of the sentence is a mirror of the last part of each sentence. So that's why the same thing keeps getting repeated over and over again, is because they end a sentence with a thing and then they start the next sentence with that same thing. So it doesn't work quite the same in English, but that's why it's so repetitive. It's on purpose for the rhythm of the thing. So we've got those first 4 verses. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. What had come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overtake it. So as we're in this time of dark and light, and we're thinking about those things, and we've got this image of dark and light, I wonder how we can, like how people might have seen the sort of symbolism of light and dark used in church or religious contexts. I'm thinking about like uh, the very intentional light symbolism that's used at Easter time in like high church services, where on Good Friday they like blow out all the candles and everything is dark, and then Easter is just like bright and sunny and light and full of, all like the sort of movement of light to dark in those spaces is something that comes up a lot. What have y'all experienced with the symbolism of light and dark?
It's interesting that you bring up that example, Austen, because um, the moment of the resurrection in the context of that liturgical framework happens in the dark,
Yeah.
and it doesn't happen like in a burst of light in the dark. It happens in the darkness. Like the darkness is like the sort of sacred place where that resurrection happens.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. In the resurrection narratives, it's always the women going to the tomb like in the dark before morning. Yeah. And so it is kind of funny. I mean, lots of churches have sunrise services where they do start in the dark, but I think most churches are like, we don't need to get up that early.
I'm thinking about the Easter Vigil, I think, which is, like
Yeah.
the Catholic tradition that I came from,
Mhm.
and that is like middle of the night or later at night service. with
Mhm.
a lot of that, the candle lighting and
Mhm.
but definitely like bringing the church to total darkness, and then
Mhm.
the sort of chant that symbolizes the exultet, the chant that symbolizes the resurrection happens in that time of darkness.
Mm.
Mm.
I love that. So fascinating use of light and metaphor as we understand things. How about you,
What
Micah?
what comes to mind for me is actually as soon as you said like light into darkness, like moving into darkness, like I just thought of immediately "Here I Am to Worship" by Hillsong. Um, I grew up in an evangelical background, and we like played those songs all the time, and so like that was immediately just the words popped in my head. I mean, the words are literally "Light of the world, you step down into darkness, open my eyes, let me see." And so
Mm.
the idea of there's like this, and that's not the only song, that's one of the most overt, but there's a lot of songs that kind of we would sing that would hold this idea of light is illuminating darkness, and darkness, like there is like something that needs to be removed, and you see,
Mhm.
you can read that in this passage in some ways. So I love that as you're talking about the idea of resurrection happening in the darkness, or like there are other ways that darkness can be a beautiful thing, because I do think that sometimes within at least my tradition, my church tradition growing up, there was a lot of negative assumption about darkness,
Mhm.
and this
Yeah.
passage was often pointed to talk about like we need to be the light that comes into the world, that like see just like Jesus came in, and a lot of times it's pointed to in this exact passage.
Mhm. Yeah, there's the bit about, you don't hide, like you light a candle and you put it up for the whole house to see. You don't put it under a bushel. There's like all these allusions throughout scripture to like light and it makes sense in the context of um culture. If you're living in a culture even today, or in a society today, where light is hard to keep going and like requires, like if it's fire, right, if it just requires fuel, you don't have electricity, um there can be something really scary about darkness and like the middle of the night if you can't keep your fire going or something like that. So like you understand that there's some sort of um internal, like primeval fear of the dark that I think a lot of humans have. And it seems like Christianity has kind of capitalized on that to begin using it as a metaphor for everything bad being dark and everything good being light. And like when you stretch a metaphor too far, it can be kind of dangerous. Peter, I think you had something about that.
Yeah, I think, I was just, you know, uh, thinking about the ways in which this sort of symbolism of light equals good, dark equals bad has been weaponized, often, I would say, not just sometimes, but often in by the church, in the service of anti-Black racism. And I found this really beautiful piece by Will Gaffney, Embracing the Light and the Darkness in the Age of Black Lives Matter. Um, is it okay if I just read this little quote from this piece? Sort
Yeah,
of.
go for it. I'm going to put the link in the chat right now so folks can find it.
So Will Gaffney says, this good news is framed, and speaking about this passage, this good news is framed in the stark language of light and dark, shadow and glory. And it is far too easy for us as Americans to hear those words through our history of race and racism. We are taught from a young age that everything light and white is good and everything dark and black is bad. Even when we are not thinking about it, it is in the back of our minds. Race is always in the room for us. The mystic Howard Thurman taught us that somewhere between the light and the darkness, between the shadow and glory, there is a space that he called the luminous darkness. Others have called it radiant blackness. Think of the night sky spangled with stars, or the sheen on black silk or satin, or the glow of beautiful ebony skin. We are afraid of the dark, but God is not. Darkness is a creative space to God. Out of darkness, God created everything that is, including light. I like to think that light and dark are not in conflict, but in balance.
Mm, that's so beautiful. There's
Yeah.
so many good examples.
Yep. That just seems like a really important recontextualization of that.
Mhm.
And really, even if you go back to the verse and think about it in terms of light and darkness need to find balance, as opposed to light needs to, um, you know, dominate or something. I think
Mhm.
it actually, we could read it that way, even in terms of what the words themselves.
Yeah, yeah. There's it. The complex language in different translations of like domination. It like makes the already difficult metaphor even worse.
Hmm.
It's so much better when there's a, a interpret or not an interpretation, a translation that recognizes some of that. I know that one of my I think it might actually be the King James version, the version that I grew up reading. But the wording is the light shined in darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. And I always kind of loved that in the sort of like um, it's not a battle between the two as much as it is they're just very different. I don't know. I always kind of like that translation of it. I think it matters in terms of how we understand these translations as well.
And the translation you read, the NRSV, says the darkness did not overtake it, which
Hmm.
that seems to me to kind of be actually a word that sort of works in that idea of balance. You know,
Yeah,
darkness didn't become like more than the light. There was like a balance created between the two, and like the
yeah,
beauty of both could be, recognized.
right. I think a lot of translations say the dark did not overcome it, which is kind of the same but slightly different too.
Hmm.
But it does. I think both speak to that sense of balance.
Yeah.
Micah,
I
did you
see
want to say something?
we have some comments in the chat. I see Jolene says, I am also from that background, and I think we have struggled with the mystery, thinking of Psalm 139 knit together in the dark of the womb, which, yes, I think, yeah. And I do think there are some ways that, at least from the background that I grew up in, there is a struggle with like the mystery and a wanting to make sure everything, and this idea of light kind of coming in and illuminating darkness and making everything known, can be like a way of, we can, it's almost like a way of conquering or being able to like have control over. And I think that's why, when people talk about being afraid of the dark, a lot of times it's because there's unknown, and there's
Hmm.
like, so I think sometimes that kind of idea of the sort of aggressive conquering of darkness, with the light of God, is in a way an attempt to control. And so I think that's kind of, yeah. So I really appreciate that. Um, and I see Eden says my church has been using Will Gaffney's women's lectionary for Advent readings. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Um, and Tom says God also gave us night so that we might rest. Very true.
Hmm.
Yeah. After all, Eden, after all, when there isn't any night sleep, people have done a lot of difficulty. Yeah, too much. Absolutely. I think there is some beautiful, and that I think speaks to the creative mystery of darkness.
Hmm.
Like darkness is needed for life to flourish, because we need that rest time. We need that. Yeah.
Yeah, and when Tom said too much light can be overstimulating, it reminded me of there's this song by Vampire Weekend called "Unbearably White," and it's just filled with all of these metaphors of like when things are just so bright that they're like blinding. So it's like the sun on snow when you get like snow blindness, or like the whiteness of a page when you can't think of anything to write. Like these senses of things that are just like these images of like when brightness and lightness and whiteness are just so much that they're bad. And we almost never think about it that way. So it just reminded me of that. Thank you, Tom. Well, let's see here. We got to move on because we're going to run out of time before we get to talk about all our cool things about this passage. Um, so we've got verses 10 through 11. So we got verses 5 through 9, which we kind of talked about here. Um, the light shines in darkness. The darkness did not overtake it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. So, moving on from our light and darkness, we have in verse 10, he was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. So we've got this sort of verses 10 and 11 there, I wonder if you read those verses, came into the world, yet the world did not know him, came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. I wonder if that sounds somewhat familiar to any of us. Because when I read those verses, I immediately think of what coming out can often be like, or what telling people about yourself can be like, the sense of like showing up and then having people not be excited that you're showing up, having people not be stoked that you have been your whole self in a space. So that's kind of one of the things I think of. I wonder what y'all think of this idea of coming to your own and your own not being stoked about it.
I love the idea of this as like a moment of God coming out. I think
Mhm.
I love that. And I think it also reminds me of when Jesus is in Nazareth
Yeah.
and gets rejected by the people that he grew up with. When he shares about who he is and he shares about his identity, like they're like, no, we don't want, that doesn't make sense. Even the idea of like, who is this? Didn't we know him before? I think that is a very relatable experience for many trans and queer folks of coming to, like revealing things about the deep parts of ourselves that we haven't told people before. And it being a part that it was there, but it was like I think he was in the world and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. Like there is this way that I think obviously it's a little bit different, but there's a way that we as queer folks, we can be in the world and yet the world doesn't fully know us, even though
Mhm.
we might be. And so there are ways that we can reveal as we choose to reveal ourselves. People can like lean into accepting that, or there can be also some experience of rejection. And so I don't know, I have not thought about it as a coming out story, but I think that gives me I feel a lot of solidarity in that.
Mhm.
Yeah, it makes me think of like the idea of vulnerability too, and the incarnation being like an extremely vulnerable act um,
Yeah.
of God, which is again something we're not used to thinking of God that way. We're used to thinking of God as like this, in terms of God's power and um, kind of invulnerability, like almost the
Hmm.
opposite, but the incarnation can't be really looked on any other way as like this sort of um, like God making himself accessible and available and um, you know uh, open to even like being hurt, which is what happened.
Yeah.
um, so yeah, this account of the incarnation kind of seems to emphasize that vulnerability even in this part of the passage too.
Totally. Yeah, there's a sense of, I mean, the incarnation is inherently about becoming vulnerable because you give up all the power and, everything that you had to be, like different, if nothing else, at least different. And oh my gosh, I wish I could remember who I was just hearing this from. Um, Gosh, I was just talking to somebody the other day who was talking about how disconcerting it must have been for Jesus to like be himself and have that knowledge of being God while also being human, and how like the sort of sense of like um disconnection that he must have had at some points of like, oh yeah, that's right, I'm human, I have a body. It's kind of nice to think of Jesus of sometimes being kind of like weirdly disconnected and discombobulated and having to like get himself back together again. Feels kind of nice.
Maybe that's why you had to go off alone into the desert so often.
Right.
All right.
Yeah.
Just need a second
I've
here.
been yeah, I've been completely like disconnected from myself. I gotta take a minute.
Yeah.
I see Eden says, and Jesus is not even the Messiah that people want. They have a certain idea and possessiveness of what that means. Right. So, like, not only does the world not recognize the word coming into it, but it also is like, this isn't what we ordered. Send it back.
Yeah, which like that the pain of that really seems to connect to
Mhm.
like the coming out experience of a lot of us too, of like, hey, I'm like sharing myself with you for the first time, and they're like, we don't want it, thanks.
Mhm.
you know We want the other version of you that we imagine, not the true, the truth about you.
Right. And I like too going back to the idea of like that the word was in the beginning, and then the world came into being through the word, and then the world didn't want the word. The idea there that like this being has always been there and has always existed, but to the people who are experiencing that word for the first time, they're like, oh, this is a new thing. You're new. This is we've never thought about this or heard of this, which I think is something many queer people experience when they come out, and people are like, this is complete news to us. And you're like, I have been trying to tell you for years. I have not become somebody new all of a sudden. I've always been like this.
Right.
Tom says, sometimes it's comforting knowing that Jesus was rejected. It means rejection doesn't necessarily mean there's something wrong with us. Totally, Tom. And I like that, even the idea of people being possessive over concepts. Yeah. Yes, okay, so Jolene is getting us into this idea of the incarnation, one of the craziest mysteries to ponder, fully God and fully human. So yeah, we've got this wild mystery, right? So let's, actually, before we get into that, I'm going to, I'm actually going to skip that little quote, and we're going to go on to verses 12 and 13 to talk about one more thing here, because we've kind of talked about the coming out of God in Jesus and this experience of coming out. But there's another thing that happens here in verses 12 and 13. So we talked about verses 10 and 11. He came to his own people. They did not accept him. And then in 12 says, but to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And to me, that's like an extension of the queerness of this story, because it's not just Jesus coming out and saying like, here I am. It's not just God saying like, here's who I've always been with people. But then there's this experience of like chosen family that is happening here, that this isn't about like who gave birth to you. This isn't about all the planning that people did to like make you happen. This is about like something different, a family that's created differently somehow. And so I've got this quote here. This is from Elizabeth Edmond in her book Queer Virtue. She says, Christianity is a relationship with God and with other people. It's the kind of relationship to which one commits oneself deliberately, determinedly, a chosen family. Christianity demanded that early Christians value themselves as children of God. It was an identity fraught with risk. The experience of the early church would also have been like LGBTQ experience in this way. People in the early church knew their need of each other. They needed each other to have some kind of home, some kind of family. They needed each other deeply. They needed each other to their core. And I love that quote from Liz Edmond, because she talks in her book about this idea of community and needing each other and how messy that is. Like, we all know how messy that is in like biological families, right? Like, we know that that's messy, but it can be really messy in like queer found families too. Like, we're not perfect. We often like rehash trauma that we didn't know we had, and it comes out sideways, and like it can be really complicated. So when we're talking about our faith families, some of the same things can happen. And it feels like this is a through line of like, of being in a chosen family is complicated. But the thing that I love about what these verses seem to be saying is that like, it's a family in which you are always chosen. Like, God always planned for you, and you are always chosen to be part of that, which is really powerful to me. I don't know. What do y'all think about these verses about family and adoption, or however we want to talk about it?
I love the who are not of blood or the will of the flesh nor the will of man, but of God. I think there is this way that God's invitation into chosen family, invitation into queer family, is it goes beyond the human, like our human constructs, and I think it's really beautiful, because I think so many of us have been told we're not invited into chosen family in the name of God, but yet here is this, or we're not in, even some of our biological families may have said like in reason or in like ways that, yeah, you're not necessarily part of this family, and there's rejection that has been given in the name of God, but yet here is God saying like, it's not about who is born to who. It's not about that. It's about invitation into the family of God. And it's
Mhm.
about this, like, all are invited, and I think it's a very reassuring thought. And I think it speaks, and it's a good counter to those who would try to exclude us from the family of God, because this is coming from a testament, like, this is God saying all are welcome. So
Yeah, it's always kind of incredible to me that when you actually like look at scripture, the model of family being presented as, you know, as what we should be striving for is like directly kind of in opposition to the sort of like the models of family that are idolized, especially in like, you know, uh contemporary American Christianity.
Yeah, like the nuclear family of like
Yeah.
a man and a woman and 2.5 kids.
Uh-huh. Exactly. And it's like show me that in the Bible. It's not there.
Mhm.
In fact, like the model being created or being presented as, as the model that Jesus is like urging us towards is looks a lot more like We're Chosen Family than it does that like that model, you know.
Mhm. Yeah, totally agree. Well, now we got to get into what Jolene was going to when we were talking about the incarnation here. Um, so we get to this verse in verse 14, where it's like, we were talking about this earlier, us staff members were talking about this earlier, that we could do a whole hour just on verse 14. So we promise we won't actually do an hour since we only have 10 minutes left. But verse 14 says, "The word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a father's only son, full of grace and truth." And there is so much, even just in the first, like up to the comma in that sentence. The word became flesh and lived among us. There is so much there, because that is a absolutely wild thing to say. Like, both at the time this was written and still now, like, it's an absolutely wild thing to say. This is the only direct mention of incarnation in the Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke do constantly talk about how Jesus is the Son of God, but this is the one place where we're given this idea of like Jesus is God in a body. And so John is really like the center of incarnational theology throughout Christian history. And people argue about it for years and years and years after. We had to have like 8 different councils, the Council of Nicaea and Chalcedon and everybody else, to just like decide what the heck John is talking about when he's talking about the word becoming flesh. So it's weird, because this would have been an impossible idea, because people thought of flesh as this thing that is like inherently perishable, right? This thing that like bodies die, right? And it goes back to the idea of like Isaiah 40, where there's this verse about like all flesh is grass. We are like the flowers of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of the Lord is forever, right? So this idea of like flesh and the word are two opposite things. Flesh goes away, the word is forever. And so to say the word becomes flesh is like an absolute paradox that nobody really knew what to do with. And so we're going to talk a little bit about incarnation and how absolutely buck wild it is. Um, let's talk a little bit about gender and how that affects the idea of the incarnation. Micah, I think you had something there.
yeah, I think the beautiful thing about, just in general, about the incarnation, it is a huge mystery. It doesn't make sense. It's a paradox. Even if we try to wrap our heads around it, it's hard to wrap our heads around it. Just like you pointed out, Jillian, like, I think it's such a it's so hard to comprehend. And at the same, and but it also brings so much life to so many people, because it actually speaks to the inherent beauty and of the body, of our
Mm.
physical being. And that God, who is the word, the animating, we were talking about the idea of word, whether we understand as the spoken word of God or the animating force of the universe, this word is becoming like us. um, there is a incredible power there. And I think there's also, for those of us who are like, for trans and gender expansive folks, there is oftentimes this feeling of um, learning to come home to our bodies, and like in allowing our bodies to be co-created with God in that. I think there's a really beautiful way that the incarnation speaks to our physicality and the importance of those things. And so I'm not gonna read this entire thing for time, but it comes from Martin Hugo Cordova Chiaro, and this is from This Body Transforming Me. Transgender and intersex people are telling us that the incarnation of Christ is not just a servant of hetero-patriarchal taxonomy, but a cosmic event that embraces multiple and distinct beings into the divine. The option of God, an option in this, it means the choice of God to incarnate a human body is not trivial, but a sublime act to dignify the beauty of every single human body. And I think that just beautifully captures the way that God's incarnation is a testament to the beauty of bodies and the beauty of our physicality. And especially in so many traditions that attempt to separate those things, or especially traditions, there's a history of traditions also gendering the more divine being the more spiritual as more masculine, and bodies as more feminine and the physical. And there's ways that God entering into that kind of queers that idea of gender and that kind of hierarchy of spirituality and masculinity over bodily femininity. And so I think, yeah, those are, I love thinking about that. And it's just such a beautiful thing to me.
Mhm. Yeah, there's so much that can be said about like the idea of the importance of like if Jesus is meant to be this salvific force for all human beings, then Jesus can't just be the salvific force for men. Like it can't just be like Jesus's maleness and like his being assigned male in that way. We have to understand it differently because otherwise the entire rest of our theology doesn't make sense. Like Jesus has to be a little bit more genderqueer than that in some way. Eden says, sort of like gender and sex not always being the same and blowing people's minds. When I've talked about it, I say it doesn't make sense to me, but I know it's true for me and other folks. Yeah, it's one of those mystery things. Like, we don't know why, like, if we say Jesus is 100% human and 100% God, that's 200%, and it does not make sense, but it is what we believe. There are some things that we don't understand, but we respect, and there's something about us that knows it, even if we don't know how or why we know it. Yeah, I like Eden, you're connecting it to ideas there that we have a hard time, like people might not understand, but like that doesn't make it any less true. Oh yeah, true. Tom's talking about the first big splits in the church. It's true. So much of it was about things like the incarnation. So I'll take 1 second to sort of be a nerd about language here one more time to talk about this idea of what it means that the word dwells among us. So in this version, we've got the word became flesh and lived among us, right? In the Greek, it's actually a word that essentially means like tented, like put up a tent and lived there for a while. In Hebrew, it would be related to the word tabernacle, right? So the tabernacle was like this movable thing that that God lived in with the Hebrew people during the Exodus period. And so this idea of God like essentially putting up a tent to live with humans for a while is a great, like, what a great metaphor for the idea of Jesus. Like you're not putting up a stone building that's going to be there forever. You're putting up a tent because eventually then Jesus is going to go away and he's going to come back. Like it's a movable, malleable thing. And it's such a great metaphor that they went with there. So I wanted to read a tiny quote from the classic Marcella Althaus Reed from her book Indecent Theology. She talks about she calls it the bi nature of Christ, or the bi Christology. As a bisexual person herself, that's where she's coming from. But she says, bi Christology walks like a nomad in the lands of opposition and exclusive identities, and does not pitch its tent forever in the same place. The verb is to have dwelt among us as a tabernacle, or put his tent among us. The image conveys Christ's high mobility and lack of fixed space or definitive frontiers. Tents change in shape in strong winds, and their adaptability, rather than their stubbornness, is one of their greatest assets. I love that she picked that out and was like, yeah, actually, the fluidity of Jesus is one of his great assets. And this idea of like being in a tent and camping with humanity is such a great way of thinking about it. So that's where that Greek word comes from, is to tabernacle, or to have a tent among a people. I think we have one more thing about the incarnation we got to talk about real quick. And that is this idea of the fluidity of God's parenthood in Jesus. Micah, was that yours?
That's for Peter.
Oh, that's Peter's.
Yeah, I just found this really interesting commentary that talked about the word used for, that's usually translated as only begotten, genethane, apparently can be, like in the original, can mean either birthed or begotten. So like, you know, the sort of the begetting, which is thought of as the male role in conception, versus the birthing, which is thought of as the female role, are both encompassed in this word. Which is something I had not heard before, but just kind of thinking about, again, like the parenthood of God, having this gender fluidity to it, and encompassing like all of those different aspects of, you know, bringing new life forth, and the sort of like parental intimacy and relationship between God and Jesus, encompassing all those things. So I thought that was a cool aspect to that word.
That is really cool. That's actually new to me too. I hadn't heard that before. I'm not a huge Greek person, and so I love learning new things about interesting Greek words. So like I said, we could talk for hours about incarnation because it's fascinating and there's so much to say there, but we won't do that to save y'all time. One final thing that we want to mention, though, is as we continue to read on here, there's a little bit of a complication. So in verse 15, it says, John testified to him and cried out, "This was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks ahead of me, because he was before me. From his fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." And so we wanted to make a little note there of the way that John's gospel has historically been used against Jewish folks, our Jewish siblings. So I think this one was the one you had, Micah, right?
Yeah, and I think it's important to not gloss over those anti-Semitic, potentially anti-Semitic remarks in John. And this isn't the only place that occurs in John. And so I think
a lot.
It happens quite a bit. And so I think making sure that we don't gloss over it, because I think if we gloss over it, then we can just continue to uncritically perpetuate those same thoughts. And so especially because historically these texts and these passages have been used by Christians against the Jewish people. I think it's important to note that it's there. And so it is kind of like in the midst of this really beautiful thing, this can also be a moment of like, oh, that's uncomfortable, and we need to sit with the discomfort. I just to pass on a really quick quote I found. This is from Robert Hill at Austen University, and who is talking in an interview. Talks about kind of the dual, beautiful, poetic, but also anti-Semitic language that kind of happens in John. And he says, this community that produced the fourth gospel was in a sibling rivalry, a harsh family row with people they had known and loved, and they got to using language that is really awful. That has to be faced and dispensed with. So I think it's a really helpful context to remember that when this gospel was produced, that there had been a lot of tension and infighting among those who followed Jesus and those who were not following Jesus from the Jewish tradition. And so within that tradition, there's infighting. And just like in a family, you might say things that are not the best to say when you're fighting with your family. And so I think that's a really helpful frame to thinking about this, and just making sure that we recognize, these are uncomfortable things that are here, and we don't want to gloss over them.
Absolutely. That these were things written when tensions were incredibly high, and they've done a lot of harm, and we have to be the ones to not perpetuate it. Thank you, Micah. Thanks for bringing that. Well, we're at the end of our time together. So we have a couple of thoughts, our little end thoughts for little takeaway ideas. Oh, hi, Julia. I just saw that you popped in. Glad you're here. We've got some end thoughts to leave you with, or end questions. So the first question here, let's see. Peter, you want to read the first question?
Sure. The first question is, how does God coming out in Jesus and God inviting us into the family connect with our experience of queerness?
Question to hold. You have one, Micah?
Yeah. How does the incarnation help us understand and appreciate our bodies more?
And mine would be, how does God's presence among us change how we experience the present moment? How does God's tabernacling among us change things? So those are the big questions we're going to leave you with. And we hope you have a wonderful longest or shortest night, depending on which hemisphere you're in, and a warm Christmas. And don't forget, we've got that hangout coming up on Friday. If you need some community, we will be there. It's going to be a fun time. And yeah, I hope you end up feeling accompanied and like you're not alone in the midst of this time of year and in this season, because you're not. Not only are there many other people like us out there that are experiencing this season alongside you, but also we've got God just tabernacling all over the place. Anything else you want to say, Peter, Micah, before we close out?
Nope, I think that's it.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody for being here, and we will see you again next month. Our next Bible study will be January 18th, third Wednesday of the month. So we will see you on January 18th. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye all.